I am very, very pleased that Anna-Louise is here. Anna-Louise Milne is Director of Graduate Studies and Research and lecturer at ULIP, the University of London Institute in Paris. She's a researcher, an academic, but over the past decade or so, she's also built up the Paris Center for Migrant Writing and Expression. And that's not just an academic center studying the writing by migrants, but it's also an agency that helps migrants write and writes with migrants across languages. And last year, when Anna-Louise came to London, she showed some wonderful examples of booklets made by migrants together with, I think, colleagues in the translation process. So her research explores city culture, and particularly Paris culture. She looks at Paris as an archive, but not only bound to French language or national language, but going well beyond that. One of her most recent publications is a monograph entitled Floral Cultures and Spatial Politics, and that is the result of a joint project with the Institut de Culture d'Islam in Paris. She's also an author herself and has explored Paris creatively in a volume entitled 75 Paris. So her work is very much in all these different areas, very much connected with encounters of urban cultures, urban encounters in various ways, and the language and the stories we tell about these urban encounters. And her talk today will focus on one particular, very, very urban space, the metro. So welcome, Anna-Louise.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you for that overview of different writerly acts, indeed. I'm not going to be talking about the collection, but I do feel like, since you mentioned it, the book collection that we've been making, which is taking place at a public library, and I'm just going to throw out there the word that is the name of this collection, which is Numérique. So you can work out which language that is, and we can come back to that over lunch. In the meantime, a more familiar word, no doubt, if we can get this to come up. Metropolitan. Okay, language in compressed spaces. Now, I think I'll sit down now. Do you think that's okay? Everybody can see? Okay, so, flights of fancy, se donner des ailes. A few years ago, I described myself as finding a more lively sense of self by looking up at the windows of the metro train as it clatters past the wings of iron above me. A corner of the city, I wrote, that I had so frequently explored, the unceasing movement through it founded me, by implication, more than the state-led rationalities that were reshaping the landscape around me. The blinking eyes of the metro cast a gaze that made me feel particularly me amidst the ruination of the textures of life that were being smoothed out and boxed in as this city, to which I had repeatedly returned, underwent a massive phase of renovation. What of me was I tied to in that shuddering moment, I wonder? But first, and here with you at the beginning of this conference on translingual writing, I wonder what sort of wings was I imagining as the buttress for this affirmation? Jaurès, Stalingrad, La Chapelle, Barbès, and between them, the overground metro, Line 2, Ligne 2, a cast iron structure of intersecting girders under a succession of gently curving spans. Des ailes? Wings? The word starts quickly to tremble. It knows no limits, for me. Not like the words that define the perimeter of existence in La Place by Annie Ernaux. For Ernaux, writing is anchored in the constitutive intransigence of knowing a place, your place in the world, in a refusal of the sort of manière or mannerisms that might reveal, consciously or not, that you come from elsewhere. These particular words and sentences define the nature and the limits of the world where my father lived and which I too shared. L'on n'y prenait jamais un mot pour un autre. It was a world in which one word was never taken for another. This writing has been important for me, as it has been to many contemporary writers of French. Its attention to everyday speech, its resistance to metaphorization, its unswerving poise in the shame of individuation. She declares in La Honte, or Shame, that she wants to write books of words so definite, so binding, that it becomes impossible subsequently to speak of them. Too shameful. But I'm always taking one word for another, and then wondering what I got myself tangled into. Have I caused possible offense or confusion, crossed wires? Because la métaphore m'arrive. Metaphor happens to me in unexpected lurches, rattling between rails. Do I get wings? Do they get me? I'm not saying that the burn of shame isn't a factor, but it doesn't necessarily know what's provoking it. Speaking from within that moment of writing is to be strung across a divide, not anchored in a place. The metro thunders past the silver girders, the winsome trees. I feel myself in its movement, Stalingrad, La Chapelle, Barbès, and that sensation puckers out in the cautious extension of wings. The outline for this conference announces an interest in emancipatory women's writing, in breaking up established ways of thought. I'm thinking about this, about flights of writing and flickering gazes. For Ernaud, driving the motorway with its carousel of exits and junctions becomes a seamless glide in the collective noise of the world. As she drives, she throws away her youthful desire for a langage inconnu, an unknown language. She has reached the realization that she can only write in the language she has always known. I am reading this and thinking, this is a harmonious remeditation with history, or a headlong relation to the present and its discourses. I find it super exhilarating. She goes really fast. Her text plummets along through the landmarks of post-war culture in provincial France, gradually getting closer to the capital, to the center of intellectual life as the author gets older, finds recognition, always moving through it with that same unswerving poise. Is this emancipation? Sometimes it makes me want to whistle, under my breath, in admiration, but maybe that's a bit vulgar. Around here, between Jaurès, Stalingrad, La Chapelle, Barbès, it's hard to go fast. Too much stuff littering the streets, boxes, bags, scraps of clothes, broken parts of bikes and scooters, abandoned furniture, tossed together into the deep gutters. I wanted to detail this stuff before it got scooped up and dumped in large skips, some destined to be recycled within the network of productive society, some just to be abandoned in landfill, too toxic to be burned. It was these remainders that mattered to me, stuff that couldn't or wouldn't be recycled. People, too, different guises of life that had arrived here from very near and very far, taking root and yet cast outside the networks of discourse that course through our world. I didn't want to lift it clean into English, towards the destinations that are mine, spaces like this one, in the solid bastion of the university, where it seemed inevitable that these soundings from the streets of contemporary superdiversity in Northern Europe would get inflated. But the immersion that is Ernaud's was not possible either. Not for me, that sparse, flat accumulation of the exteriors of the world. Combien vous avez payé ça? Rien que le cul. Difficult for me to get that incontrovertibility. The words on these streets, tipped together in an overwhelming contact zone, don't have that weight. Not for me. At best, I can muster a leaning towards them, a finding myself crushed against, a shuttling along with. Every day, I brushed my way through the informal market of knockoff goods displayed on pieces of fabric or held out in that posture that protects and invites cigarettes, phones, headphones, Marlboro, bled, cigarette, détail, détail, unité, cigarette, détail. shuffling the packets like cards. 5 euros, 5 euros, 50 unités, 50 unités, 4 euros, 4 euros, Lady, Zigarette, Allemagne, Deutsche, Bled, Marlboro, Bled. Sometimes they whistled too, perched on the barriers between the pavement and the traffic flowing north. And I became, in my own writing, cette grande Parisienne qui passe et repasse tous les jours, and who seems perhaps to provoke a sort of fierté un peu mystifiée, a slightly mystified pride in the young men living off the streets. A camera was part of that negotiation too, an appareil, a tool or a piece of equipment in French, much more intended towards an investigative end than the English word camera. It came between us and established the positions. The corner boys, jostling in apparent good humour, I myself, generally in well-kept clothes. Lady, Deutsche, spreche Deutsch, Zigarette, Detail, Unité. If not the camera, I would turn to the metro, Stalingrad, La Chapelle, and modernist literature. They're not so different, maybe. The metro is inseparable from modernist fascination with visual and temporal condensation, with a compacting of experience into one tight, resistant image. Metro-modernism can be said to begin with Ezra Pound and his 1913 poem, In a Station of the Metro. 2 unequal verses produced after 18 months of compression, during which a more traditional 30-line poem was compacted down. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. The inspiration was the haiku form, and the image of the outlined petals on the black bough calls to mind the frequent appearance of petals and boughs in Japanese art. Pound referred to it as the direct treatment, emphasizing the absence of the observing or poetic eye, or of any verbal structures in favor of the contrasting rhythm of the long iambic first verse, followed by the strongly accented second verse. This was a form of superposition. Godard referred earlier to superpositioning, one idea set on top of another, to record the precise instant when the external world meets and transforms itself on contact with the inner world of the poet. As Marianne de Koven has argued, the luminosity and fragility of nature's cycles is figured along with the mechanical churn of the crowded metro, that uneven black line of bough or rails that runs horizontally under the pale faces of the voyageurs, or voyageuse, because the fragility of these petals tells us that the metro emotion that prompted this poem for Pound was provoked by the sight of a woman. The gendered facelessness of the petals balances in opposition to the way the station is squarely positioned within the modern city by its definite article. It is the metro. The poem's title affirms its place in the banality of contemporary history, while its central image pushes the people, and in particular the women in the metro, into being apparitions, which then become flora. The poem is a process of mastery, in which Japanese art and the everydayness of Parisienne riding the city's newly mass transportation system are integrated into modernist metaphor. Jaurès, Stalingrad, La Chapelle, Cigarette, Bled are the wings of my metro emotion, petals or boughs. Fragile or rugged? Does my recomposition of self, imagined in the metaphoric gaze of the metro, function also through a similar sort of mastery, compressing the crowd of today into an abstracted gaze that flickers at me through the trees? How does gender intersect with this question? Pound inaugurated the metro poem as a space for experimentation with impersonal forms. His modernist exile had brio enough to absorb the particulars of the world into the delicacy of petals. I'm not surprised I threw myself a line in that direction, that I envisaged roping myself provisionally into that tradition of psychic dislocation. After all, I'm a literary scholar, first and foremost, trained in the tradition of comparative literature with a strong anchoring in modernist aesthetics. I've been drawn to literature and moved by it all my life, and I want whatever writing I might do to perpetuate the possibility that literary form has some articulation with emancipation. Along that stretch between planche à repasser, sac de couchage, Jaurès, Géophare, ironing board, Barbès, Papier, Vigile, La Chapelle, sleeping bags, Papier, there was an exhilaration to be had in swinging upwards from the debris of unprepossessing nouns to hover on those uncertain wings in the glancing eyes of the metro. I thought it might provoke a greater sense of liveliness. In that respect, I was more mystified than when I took my camera with me. Then the idea of a tool to bring between myself and the world was quite self-conscious, and self-conscious too the decision to leave it behind. In contrast, the attachment to a writerly posture is hardwired, no easy detaching from it, and my breezy claim that a livelier sense of self would be my due from a reworking of the tropes of metro-modernism now seems naive. Perhaps more, for it is also trapped in that sort of fastidiousness that Stephen Kelman has noted as perhaps the mark of the consummate technician that the translingual writer may be. I hummed and I ha'd as I passed and I repassed about what to do with the elision of the preposition before those eyes, fearing a sort of archaism, relying on dictionary reassurance to arrive at clignant comme autant Dieu. I could write it. I struggle to say it because when it comes to my lips, it brings with it a whole host of gods or Dieu that I never anticipated in this place. But does writing ever escape from the uncontrollable affect of voice? I turn. Wait, did I just call myself out, heckler to my own self as Parisienne struggling along in metaphoric finery? This is a jibe to the mental acrobatics of the literary critic considering her own writing. And really, in a nod forward to another poet who's coming down the line in this paper after pound, I need to get those wings out of my hair. For Arnaud, the body is the touchstone for idiom. She draws a firm line between the way Proust attributes picturesque patois, or the dialectical expressions to his maid, and the way they rise unchecked to her lips. If she charges Proust with fetishizing popular idiomatic expressions, it is because she feels her own writing to be anchored in a specific and stable subject position, a nous, an us, that speaks the same way, with the same voice. But what sort of us can I imagine in the disorientation of Stalingrad, La Chapelle, Barbès? And what sort of act is it to write from within this disorientation in the French learned largely from reading in a university library? These are my guiding questions today, but they have little to do with my personal subjectivity. I'm not my language, not in the way that Arnaud is her idiom. I have to try and say something else about language and place, something that is strung between the embodied attachments of place and the elevations of non-place, from where I imagined I might feel myself more fully, suspended on those literary wings before the unseeing eyes of the metro. There's a long, long history to the elevation of cultivated self-reflection, of the intellectual or poet who posits an identity between thought and interiority, as Pound does with his one idea set on top of another. The other history we need is shorter. It stems back mainly to the broad rise of sexual politics and gender studies from the 1970s, with its antithetical drive to foreground bodily knowledge against mental abstractions. Arnaud's knife and stone belong in that moment, two tools she takes up to shatter the discourses of liberal emancipation and its promises of social and psychic mobility. It founds a different sort of emancipation, one that is skeptical about heroic authorship, be it that of the critic or the writer, one that tends indeed to level that distinction with its sensitivity to how lived life throws the destiny of an idea off course, one that has found its expression particularly in the labours of women's studies. For the thinking of this present paper, that difference is important, but it also tends to fade as I move off back down the boulevard. Barbès, Rochechouart, La Chapelle, I've stowed my camera, the trees are in leaf, they are wrapped in plastic sheaths. Here we are building a new promenade urbaine. Public space will be rebalanced. The French says is rebalanced, because the present tense est can say that. It can say the future in the present. I admire the firmness of that present or that future. L'espace public est rééquilibré. The ground is gritty, muddy, where puddles have formed. Cigarette, bled, Marlboro, bled, 2 euros, 2 euros, sister, 2 euros, 2 euros. Cheaper on this side of the metro. I step into the gutter, over a bollard. It has to do with impersonality, that present tense, with the capacity of language to eclipse the subject. Petals on a wet black bough. Rien que le cul. L'espace public est rééquilibré. This is one process of compression, compression that severs all evidence of relationality. That's what happens in Pound's modernist metaphor. It's what happens when Erno drags up stone words from the depths of the stream. But the metro is all about relationality. How to get from A to B, how to connect surface and underground, where the individual subject's trajectory intersects with these connections and correspondences. How it rubs along beside people going elsewhere, reading other things. This was the project that Marc Auger undertook in his essay Un ethnologue dans le métro, inaugurating what would be called l'ethnologie du proche, or everyday life studies, at about the same time, 1986, as Elna was making her own notations during her daily underground journeys. The proximity between Elna and Auger stops there, however, for Auger's journey in the Paris underground is the occasion for the eminent ethnographer to revisit an explicitly personalized relationship to the city and its culturally organized spaces. He narrates the different periods, une période Montparnasse, une période Saint-Michel, of his metro usage, positing from the outset that they will ultimately hold together in the palm of his hand as a life story holds together, connecting family origins directly through thought and on to romance. The subway map is also la carte du tendre, ou la main ouverte. You have to know how to fold and study closely in order to blaze a trail from the lifeline to the headline to the heartline. This vision of a complete circuit opens up onto the thought that, well, others may travel it differently. Of course, but all these different journeys for Auger are relative to the réseau or the network. And the most disorienting of presences that he encounters is a person identifiable by his green hair and the earring in his nose. Turns out to be un jeune, we might say a punk, a relatively recognizable figure of the 1980s, and caught in these same recognizable forms of foreigners. American tourists, of course, Germans heading to the opera, of course, Africans heading north to the northern districts of the cities, Asians heading south to buy their food in Chinatown. In Auger's metro, everyone knows which way to go, and everyone is sufficiently readable to one another. And that readability extends a long way, all the way to the river Senegal, in fact, where, one day, in an outpost of globalization, where the corrugated iron roofs have replaced the traditional straw, telling the observant ethnographic observer that the returns for migrant labor are trickling their way back, where Auger was, he tells us, cordially embraced by a man who informed him that he had lived several years in Barbès, Rochechouart. Ah! Barbès Rochechouart, replied the ethnographer, before breaking into shared laughter in a moment of what seems to offer post-colonial repair. Ah, Barbès, enfin arrivé at the end of all that history. Ah, Barbès, non, B, Barbès, ou D, Gare du Nord, D, H, non, 2, ligne 2, ou 4. Possible 4, marcher, on peut marcher, pas loin, là tu vois, non. Bon, C, L ou E. Mais non, ce n'est pas la bonne direction. Hey, no, come back. I often give directions, I often get asked, stopped in my tracks, and sometimes I ask too. In her work on queer phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed has developed the idea of turning points in the lines we are directed towards, that direct us and that we perform for ourselves, more or less in continuity with what we set out to do or to be. These turning points work against the investments we have in our lifelines. the investments that others have in us too. They push down on us, they bring pressure to us to follow a certain course. We are, says Ahmed, pressed into lines, and the directions that we follow offer the magic of arrival. But if we reassign those directions for ourselves in a queering of self, we have another expression, I think, of emancipation. Barbès, La Chapelle, Stalingrad, Lady, Cigarette, Bled, Sister, Bled. Ahmed's work has great appeal for this reader. I'm keenly drawn to the transformational potential she identifies in everyday phenomenologies, in the things and words and solicitations that we pay attention to or turn towards. This was a large part of what got me writing, along with a moment when I turned back or round, called out by an encounter, like that whistle in the street, that I recognized as for me, and also in some necessary way as being untoward. The writing of the book that underpins the only really serious claim I might make on your interest here, which is that translingual novel without fiction, was composed in that space between recognition and the sense of untowardness. And it is this turn to writing literarily in French, and in this turn to writing literarily in French, there was both inevitably a prior set of lines playing out, that modernist predisposition that had me bringing Baudelaire with me up to La Chapelle and finding a way of writing contemporary rubbish with him, as well as a shedding of that framework that offered me certain guarantees. This loose mapping of the translingual trajectory, which I'm adapting from Ahmed, is a common one. Many of the acknowledged translingual writers of French share a tendency to deviate from within an attachment to the traditions of the corpus, from readerly immersion to writerly experimentation. And I'm very interested to hear whether this is the case in other literatures that will be discussed over the next 2 days. But I'm not fully satisfied with it. And in my last 5 minutes, I'd like to try and express an alternative. For I wonder whether the Translingual project really does have to start and spread from within the self. The question is not an opposition, as such, to an orientation towards subjectivity, but a reflection of the fact that in writing my story, if that is what I can be said to have done in producing 75, that book I mentioned, the route to self-realization was crossed by all sorts of alternative possibilities. And I'm interested in thinking how, why, and if self-realization has to become the recommended itinerary or the dominant narrative, when in fact we might see more things going on if we hold back on the magic of arrival. It has to do with impersonality again. And I'm going to try and stay a bit more expository, in a bit more of an expository mode to conclude. And I'm going to start by drawing on one of the great moments of Franco-Anglo translingualism in women's writing that I encountered recently. It's from that poet I mentioned earlier, without naming her, Juliana Sparr. I'm just going to pick out the one line that's in bold here. She writes, "I've just finished a collaboration with a friend, and I want to get his tongue out of my hand. And so I fill it with tradition." It's a beautiful line, I think, which wraps the erotic pleasure of tongue language into the body pen of social relations in collaboration, in a way that flirts more than it betrays or reveals, that disrupts, I think, the sort of distinction I drew earlier between the emancipation of mind and the emancipatory body of post-68 gender and queer theories. Present, flickering in the rub between the languages, the body is not required to carry the burden of proof here. Whether that proof be the sort of unflinching poise that I admire in Erno, or the broad-minded, open-handed, integrative interest that Auger expresses. And this is because it is flickering, that body, between the two languages, in something similar to the way in the longer paragraph of poetry that you have here, and I have some handouts afterwards as well, and the poem as a whole, the work is built around a flickering of sorts, a flickering that can bring you from the iambic pentameter to spot price listings. And of course, those spot price listings are also flickering themselves at all times. So my last question is, what does it mean to turn here, and specifically to turn to tradition? I don't think it means a relation to a canon exactly, or to a particular library, though it is obviously also that, because no art, no verbal productions is ever not also the result of a particular formation or library. But why that term might be useful here as we develop our collective thinking of translingualism over the next 2 days is for the alternative it offers to the interpellation, hey you, in which the individual subject hears him or herself in structure, in ways that Judith Butler, Sarah Ahmed have developed out of Althusser. The term for SPA is towards an impersonal possibility. That is, towards structures and discourses that are a series of possible intersections between which we ricochet. Picking up snippets, relaying fag ends, catching breathy intimations and the shadows of winsome trees, leaning in, crushing up against, shuttling along with, and never quite bathing in magic of arrival. Thinking translingualism as non-arrival within the time-space compressions of globalization, that is, as something other than integration, whatever the pressures of convention, allows me to end this paper in the metro, translanguaging with no way out, accompanied by the extraordinary Topographie idéale pour une agression caractérisée by Rachid Bouguera. Written 10 years before Auger's ethnography of the metro, it could be considered to be an early iteration of such a project, written from the point of view of a migrant labourer recently arrived in Paris, whose train arrives at the wrong station, causing him to wander on and off trains and down corridors for several days, only to be murdered in an unmotivated attack once he makes it to the surface. The writing is rich with metaphoric suggestiveness, and strange fragments, strange directions, adverts, misheard names. This writing fills a hand or a map that cannot exist between this man's disorientation and the multiplicity of semiotic systems that crisscross one another to make the metro an ideal topography for an aggression. It's an impossible sort of filling, as Mireille Rossello has argued, because it just doesn't connect. Or, if it connects, sorry, that's an extract, I'm not going to read it, and I'll give it to you on paper in a minute. It doesn't connect. This writing can't connect, is my claim, I think, here. If it does connect at certain points and seems to offer a breakthrough to some form of knowledge, that breakthrough is subsequently withdrawn or interrupted. The novel tells us something about a hostile environment. We know that from the outset. For Rossello, the only way to read this difficult and frustrating text is to think of it as a process of accompaniment. And I'm very touched that you picked up on that idea of the writing with. I personally wasn't thinking through that paradigm, I was thinking through the notion of accompaniment, but of course that is writing with, accompanying. The accompaniment, though, I think, of reading this book is like accompanying the distraught migrant who can find no point of purchase within his or her disorientation, like going down the corridors of this metro with somebody who has no sense of how to get out. I find this thought deeply interesting and duly difficult. It is, I think, a significant breaking with established ways of thought, and most particularly with the established way of thought that looks to literature as a terrain for reparative, emancipatory work. But it does still look to literature. It looks to it to be the space where the disorientation of language worlds compressed together can be textualized, and therefore can become the occasions for other sorts of transactions, other sorts of intersections, such as this one. I'm personally still at a loss as to know how I textualize the disorientation that is mine every day in La Chapelle, Barbès, Stalingrad. I've experimented with forms of transcription, just as I've given a loose lead to the literary imagination and its metaphoric impulses. That process is, wings and all, work in progress. For now, though, and here, it is an impersonal potentiality that I want to emphasize, through the only words that are in some sense the emigrants in Bouguera's topography. These words are the unwritten telegram home, sent telegram home to send word of his safe arrival, which he's planning while he also imagines himself being thrashed to death. The only variation around these words, which recur several times in the book, is whether he should sign them or not. He doesn't sign them. He doesn't send them. He doesn't write them. They never go. And I don't think they can, within the terms of this book, be said to give voice as such to a migrant subjectivity. The point of this book is that the subjectivity is fully crushed by the metropolitan topography and the sorts of innovations of créolité, of transliteration, of orality that have marked some of translanguaging's work's effort to disrupt the province of literary language are not the ones that Budjera reaches for. Strictly speaking, this is not a translingual novel, if it means anything to say that, though Budjera was a speaker and writer of both Arabic and French. The translanguaging that we can observe here does not happen between subject positions, that of departure from an origin and arrival in a new linguistic landscape. In their sparseness and their rub between English and French, these words subsume those positions, saying both that the novel form has space for the radically vertiginous disorientation of the emigrant, and that this space is nothing other than the compression together of impersonal forms. Arrivé, stop. Saint, stop. Sauf, stop. And I'll stop there.
Good evening and welcome again. So most of you I've welcomed this morning already, but welcome, triple welcome to those who've joined us now. I'm Rudla Sussex. I convene German Studies here at the Institute. We are, for a couple of days, we are running a conference here on translingual writing, but this evening's event is part of a series that I've been running for a few years now with Nottingham University. And what we're doing is we're inviting writers and translators to talk, first of all, quite generally about their books and the process of writing, the process of collaboration, where it occurs, but then also really to get into the nitty-gritty of it and to look at the texts themselves. So this is what you're in for, and I am really, really pleased to be able to welcome Katja Petrowskaja and Shelley Frisch. I will start by just giving a very quick introduction. I think most of you know these writers anyway, but quick introduction and then we'll launch into questions and into the texts. So if I sit down, am I still, you can still hear me, okay? Yes. Okay. So Katja Petrowskaja was born in Kiev, later lived in Moscow as well, and grew up speaking Russian. That's what's of interest to us here as translingual researchers. She started learning German quite late in life. Too late. In her mid-20s, and then moved to Germany, and now you've been living in Berlin for quite a while, haven't you?
Yeah, so it's not an excuse anymore.
Katja's been writing first for Russian papers, then for German newspapers. But this project, or the idea of the Vielleicht Esther book, has been on her mind for a long time. And she submitted a short extract or a short text, which is now one of the central episodes, one of the central stories of the finished book. She submitted this to the jury for the Bachmann Prize. Now, the Bachmann Prize is one of the most prestigious prizes in Germany.
I didn't know.
And she promptly won it. It is now really something like the heart piece of the book, and it deals with Katja's great-grandmother's death in Ukraine, in Kiev. In 2014, So 1 year after winning the Bachmann Prize for this extract, the whole book was published, Vielleicht Esther, and it received a lot of attention straight away because although there is a lot of publication at the moment in Germany about people looking for stories of their ancestors, there's quite a lot of that, but this voice was really original, really different, and the engagement with the quest itself of finding out about family history, the treatment of remembrance, and of course the hugely original handling of language really made it stand out. So after the Bachmann Prize, other prizes followed, the Schubert Prize, Ernst Toller Prize, Aspekte Literaturpreis, Strega European Prize.
All the suicide.
And it's been translated into something like 20 languages. Yes, yes.
Vielleicht.
Thank you. And Shelley Frisch produced the English translation, or the American translation, should I say, for HarperCollins in 2018. So I now move seamlessly over to Shelley. Shelley has been working as a translator and writer for almost 25 years. Before that, she was in academia in German studies at various US universities. Her translations are mainly in the area of history and cultural history, and they are geared towards an academic audience, but also beyond, aren't they?
I think they're actually mostly for general readership.
Right.
Most are in fact biographies.
Right, yes. Yes, there's a whole, there's a run of 3 books on Kafka, Rainer Stach's 3 Kafka books she's translated, 2005, 2013 and 2016. But then also a completely different register, I think, a translation also of letters. This is due to come out very soon. The last letters, the prison correspondence between Helmut and Freya von Moltke. That's really quite a different project, isn't it? So Shelley is not only a translator, but she's also been teaching translation. She's been running workshops on translation. She's been publishing on the translation process. And she has also won many prizes. I'll just mention 2 here. In 2010, she won the Independent Publishers Book Award Gold Medal for the translation of a book entitled How Julius Fromm's Condom Empire Fell to the Nazis.
AskMeAnything.com.
And then in 2014, the Helen and Kurt Wolf Translators Prize. And now for both of them, and that I think is really exciting, for both publications, for both authors, they were shortlisted for the Women in Translation, the Warwick Prize, and currently they are also both shortlisted for the Pushkin House Russian Book Prize, which celebrates the best books about the Russian-speaking world. The Russian-speaking world. That's how they style themselves. Yes.
So it's impossible to escape.
Okay.
My country right now.
Yes. I will not. I think we should not assume anything. I know many of you have read the book, or possibly even both books, the original and the translation. But we are not going to assume anything, so I would just like to start by giving Katja the opportunity to tell us what the book is about. I know this is a very...
That's a
No, this book is absolutely not about. So therefore I don't know how to start, because I think that one of the mistakes in English edition that it's called was called memoir, and it's not a memoir. There is a genre description. Unfortunately, there isn't some description because I didn't need it. But you know that editors nowadays have to put the book on a certain shelf, so I've been asked to explain, is it a novel or whatever. So, and in German it has a title, Geschichten, which is like at the same time the stories and the histories. So, and it's very important because it's not a novel, although there are many books written already in 20th, 30s, in the 20th century, which are less novel than that. But I really didn't want to pretend to write a certain linear narrative or to have the certain I or ich in the text, which is like similar to ich in the next story. So that is actually maybe this book. I have to forget this word. It's hard to say what is it about because family it's only part of the material. It's more. It was a sort of necessity to understand what I'm doing in like Chapman said, what I'm doing here. So. So it's more like walking around this question, and so it's not about past, it's not about family, it's about certain modern, more or less modern person living in Berlin, stumbling over history, and actually that's exactly the question: what is this history? And the family in this perspective is only the Propust.
Well, I don't know.
Ausweis, Erlaubnis, permission to enter the site. And actually, it's more about this kind of European landscape where we are moving. We are just inside, and all these historical catastrophes are existing simultaneously in a way. At least when I think, actually, in the perception of history in Great Britain is very, very different. I mean, it's enough to see Westminster and to walk on the Thames. It's something which is absolutely unprecedented in my country. So it's more about like one person in this European landscape, and this landscape is actually a concept of history.
No, I think that's opening the door to
and
in
this perspective, the language was actually, I talked about that many times. It was not the idea, it was a sort of intuitive search, which is now explained as a sort of concept. It was not some concept, a concept actually, or I just cannot serve them in a way, therefore. Actually, I was looking for something which can suit this kind of idea to talk about things about which you cannot really talk. So in a way, this
the muteness.
Yeah. So actually, this muteness. How to talk about that out of muteness. How to talk about losses. So the first step is just to lose a mother tongue. So it's not like, there are many people who are talking like it's easier to write in German. It's like more this and that. It's not that emotional, which is really incredible. German is not emotional. But I think it was more like in Russian there is a term for for people who are dealing with architecture and constructions and materials, there is a term сопротивление материалов. It's Widerstand der Stoffe. So it's resistance of material. So сопромат. So I really felt that I have to find something which is even more difficult. So to write it means to write in German was actually much more difficult than to write in Russian, because it was like against this kind of routine, this kind of talkativeness, which I have. So, and now I try to keep silence.
But doing that, did that then open up the way to see things differently, or to, to overcome difficulties and to come to points which you wouldn't have come to writing in your own language?
I really don't know, because I think both languages, actually languages are always corrupted, or languages are always innocent. I mean, it's enough to listen to one program of news to get really poisoned. So, and there is a concept of this German language, which is like barking, rough, Nazi stuff. But everybody forgets that actually Russian language of 20th century is also not only non-Berstam, So, and so growing up in Soviet Union was really very, very obvious thing, very obvious experience to resist this kind of ideologized and very approximate and very, it's not only Russian literature, and even Russian literature, it's another stuff. So, what's the question?
The question was whether overcoming the difficulties then opened up the way to seeing things differently.
Yeah, but it was anyway in between two languages all the time. And so even in the episodes the passage we would read, I suddenly saw the Russian poem, I didn't notice that before. And so it's an interesting question, but anyway, it was the search between two more or less corrupted and very beautiful languages for innocence of German language. So innocence only for me. It doesn't mean that I just can share this experience, but I wanted to make it innocent for me. And anyway, this feeling that both languages are in a way a sort of minefield was very, very strong.
It is really astonishing, isn't it? I mean, in the context of German Jewish writing, there are so many authors who will do anything, but who have real difficulty with writing in the German language, and to hear it described as innocent is just very, very surprising. It's all to do with relativity, isn't it? It's where you come from and
yeah, but it has all to do with the simple fact that there were people who left German language out of certain reasons, but at the same time I don't have more right for anything just because my relatives perished, And in a way it means that I don't have any right for this kind of racism. So for me it was important with this kind of writing to say that people who are born now or thrown into life, let's use this existential things, they're just thrown into their families, and German person of my age is exactly that innocent as I mean, I could have been German. So what the hell? Yeah. So just, it's something very, very strange and very automatical what's going on.
But the result really is that it is a very, very fresh approach to language, and therefore also a fresh approach to the topic.
Basically, just the last, I think it has also something to do with Russian literature or Russian history. It didn't have this kind of medieval ages as German had, so I really felt like I was envious that they had all these knights who fought for their beautiful ladies, even married ones. And so I really had this kind of, so for me it was about German is also a language of this kind of literature and also of Wanderungen. So this kind of person who is going, you know, like Ludwig Tieck or something like that. So people who are just looking for beauty somewhere. So, and in Russian literature it's only religious literature which has this kind of, so it's very German.
It's a certain openness, isn't it, that you're allowing.
So I go away.
So yeah, no, but the question is, you know, knowing this and you know this idea of freshness, of openness, of new approach, how do you translate that?
Let me start by saying a couple of things about my own background that feed into that, because there are parallels in my own life. I grew up in Queens, New York. Sorry to say, the same borough as our current president. I hope for not very much longer. I was born just a few years after the end of World War II. It was a very anti-German community. People wouldn't drive in a Volkswagen or drink German wine or anything like that. The way I started with German, my father was a refugee. A Jewish refugee from Gelsenkirchen, and his family scattered in all directions. When I was entering junior high school, we had to choose between French, Spanish, and German. I didn't hear very much German as a child. I heard a great deal of Yiddish, which is similar. I chose French. Well, it turned out that nobody wanted to take the German class. Anybody whose parents didn't object in writing got placed in the German class. That's how I started. Next thing I knew, I'm fast forwarding along here, I was holding a PhD in German. And here I am sitting in before you speaking about German literature, among other things. I don't know if your literature is German literature, really, but that is something that I've worked on for so many years. Another thing that's very recent in my background is that the French branch of my family, my uncle, he used to be called Moritz, now Maurice. Everybody changed their names as they went to different countries. He's no longer alive, but I have some cousins who are now in their 80s. This is the Frisch branch of the family. Our Israeli branch of the family doesn't use the C before the H, so it's taken all kinds of permutations. The French branch of the family is now trying, in a way that eerily mirrors your book, to gather letters, whatever they can find in various languages. Some are in German, some are in Yiddish, some are in various Slavic languages, and have these translated from the various languages so that we can piece together our family history. So I'm in the process of learning about my family history and was while I was translating this book. So it certainly resonated for me. All translation grapples with many of the things that you were dealing with in writing in a language not your own. So as I was translating this book, and as I'm translating, in fact, any book, I'm looking at, people always say, oh, you must be good at German if you translate from German. I say, oh no, the German book is already finished. I have to write a book in English. Because you're looking at German and you're typing English all the time. So there's a fundamental disconnect that's not, I think, dissimilar to what Katja was saying about her bilingual sort of in-betweenness. And often I find myself, you know, it looks really sort of snobby, because when it comes up and, oh, I can't really think of that expression in English, or how do you say, aus dem Stegreif, you know. But you really are in between, and I find myself, while I'm at my desk, not knowing the simple, you must hear that even though I don't speak the exact English that's spoken here in London, to put it mildly, it is my native language, and yet I find myself suddenly not knowing prepositions in English, not knowing the simplest expressions. I have to move away from the German and regain that language. So the grappling for language, I find, is in many ways a similar and maybe weirdly similar process. So in approaching this text, which also, as I'm sure you've noticed if you read the book, contains not only German, but a panoply of language. I had to make those differences in language come out in different ways, particularly where there was English. For example, if Katja wrote only you, and she wrote that in English, she was calling up Elvis Presley, and I didn't know that until she told me that, because only you is not a particularly, it doesn't jump out at you in English. I think Play It, you said, was from Play It Again, so you know, how to handle, I find in many of my translations are in fact filled with English, and those are the hardest words to translate, the hardest phrases, the hardest words, because they resonate so differently, and I need to make them jump out in the way that they did in German. When I was translating Rainer Stock's 2,000-page biography of Kafka, you know, he would write things like, "Das war ein Shot for nothing." I thought, what in the world does that mean? Turns out it was Billiard's expression, and I wasn't aware of that. And I handled it another way because I thought that a reader of a Kafka biography in English might be more puzzled than enlightened by some Billiard metaphors. We talked about that, and he was fine for when he used expressions about ricocheting across a billiards board. I used very different language that talked about going from word to world, because that's in fact what Kafka was grappling with. He wrote one of his novels in the first few chapters in the first person, and then he decided to distance himself, write it in the third person. Because he was wary of his jump from word to world. And to my way of reading the text, when you translate the text, it's your reading of it. You know, it's you have no perspective often other than your own. And so I used some other wording, and we talked about it, and he was fine with it, and we went that way. So this was a very, very exciting challenge for me, because it's a hard book to translate, and which is good. And so I had some very interesting, what is often called in German, aha moments, of, you know, when it does come together, when it hits. You don't know if your readers will ever notice it, but it's so wonderful to get things right when they work, which they sometimes do and other times don't.
Mm-hmm. So we jump right into the choice of words, the way to translate, how to translate things, how to deal with between languages. So I think we're steering towards our first passage. I would very much like to do that first. So what we're going to do is Katja's going to read in German. At the same time, you will be able to see Shelley's translation up here. So you have to work on 2 tracks.
Just like me at home.
And then we will change things around, so you are really familiar with the text and the translation, and we can then talk about that text. Katja, would you like to introduce that passage a little bit?
It's from the chapter about Warsaw, or about trips to Poland, where my family was from. But it's not actually, as I said, about my family. So I was standing in the middle of Warsaw, looking for my Jewish relatives, thinking in Russian, writing in German. So I was like representative of 2 occupation colors, and at the same time looking for victims. So it was really. So actually, that's exactly what was part of my interest in many things. But sometimes it was beyond of description. For example, I spent the chapters in the book goes like that. So some of them are too hot, and then it has to become a bit colder because it's impossible to emotionally to cope with some topics. And this is from the chapter about which goes after walking in the site of former ghetto in Warsaw. And I'm going to Modern Art Museum, finding the pictures and videos of a very famous video artist, Polish video artist, Katarzyna Kozira. Katarzyna is Catherine. And Kozira, it's again this kind of thing, you know, I think very difficult to translate because Kozir in Russian is
Yeah.
Yes. So it's like you're always it's part of the topic in the book that you are finding only losses, and everybody tells you Sie haben Glück. Yeah, you are lucky. So this Kozira is also part of the story. So it means that I was working through former ghetto, and I got so cold, and then I went to this museum, and I really almost lost my head because there were scenes in videos of this Katarzyna Kozira who was pretending to be a man, walking around almost naked in towels, and then she was losing towels and showing her pennies. So it was like, and I was sitting there after this ghetto walk. So, darf ich anfangen?
Bitte, gerne. Is it on now? It's not up, but I will look it up.
Will we have some superimposed? There we go.
Okay.
In der Nacht konnte ich nicht schlafen. Ich träumte von der Sauna, vom Ghetto, von nackten Körpern, gekrümmt in Tod oder in Genuss. Ich träumte von Anderssein, Männer und Frauen gemischt. Ich hatte Fieber. Ich erzählte Katharzyna, dass auch ich Katharina heiße, zitterte. Ich könnte auch Polen sein, sagte ich ihr, denn wie kalt ist es hier. Ich muss gar nicht spielen. Ich könnte jede sein, aber doch besser nicht. Nie würde ich es tun. Nein, lieber nichts tun. Ich habe mich auch unter anderen versteckt. Oder nein, eher zur Schau gestellt. Also das ist ein Delirium. Ich muss jetzt so gut. Schau, ich habe nichts Shoah gesagt. Du hast Shoah gesagt. Du oder ich. Entweder oder. Ich weiß nicht, ob ich jemals unter den meinigen war. Und wer sind die meinigen? Diese Ruinen um uns herum und in uns. Und die Sprachwechsel, die ich unternehme, um beide Seiten zu bewohnen. Ich und nicht ich zugleich zu erleben. Was für ein Anspruch. Ich bin anders. Aber ich verstecke mich nicht warm. Und sonst bin ich scheu. Schau, schor, kalt. Wieder ganz kalt. Aber ich kann so tun. Und ich und ich und ich. Was für ein seltsames Wort. Wie Ort. Was für ein Ort. Als ob ich zu jemandem gehört, zu einer Familie, zu einer Sprache. Und manchmal sieht es sogar so aus, als wäre es so. Ich kann mich nicht verstecken. Und das alles auf Deutsch, diese Sprache, mein angeklebtes Geschlecht. Auf Deutsch ist die Sprache weiblich und auf Russisch ist sie männlich. Was habe ich mit diesem Wechsel getan? Ich kann mir das ankleben, wie du quatschen. Ich kann mich auf den Tisch stellen und das demonstrieren. Schaut alle, ich habe es hier unten, oh mein Deutsch. Ich schwitze mit meiner auf die Zunge geklebten deutschen Sprache. But it's strange if it's not in the normal text, you know, because it's something.
And you'll notice it's all lowercase. That already sets it off visually. Are you ready for it?
Yeah.
Okay. At night, I couldn't sleep. I dreamed of the sauna, of the ghetto, of naked bodies contorted in death or in pleasure. I dreamed of difference, men and women, mix. I had a fever. I told Katarzyna that my name is also Katarina. I quivered. I could also be a Pole, I said to her, la double vie. How cold it is here. No acting needed. I could be anyone, but better not. Never would I do it. No, better do nothing. I've also hidden away among others, or no, it was more like showing off. Show. I didn't say show up. You said show up. You or I, either or. I don't know whether I was ever among my own, or who are they, my own, these ruins around us and within us, and the change of language I'm undertaking to inhabit both sides, to experience I and not I at the same time. What a thing to aspire to. I am different, but I'm not hiding, warm, and otherwise I'm shy, showa, cold, quite cold all over again, but I can play the part, and I, and I, and I. What a strange phrase. Sounds like phase. What kind of phase? As though I belong to someone, to a family, to a language, and sometimes it even looks as though that's the case. I can't hide, and it's all in German. This language, my tacked-on gender. In German, the word language is feminine, and in Russian it's masculine. What did I do with the switch? I can tack it onto myself like you, Katarzyna. I can get up onto the table and demonstrate it. Look, everyone, I've got it. Down here, oh, my German. I'm sweating with my German language tacked onto my tongue.
Some obvious questions arise from this. One thing that really struck me was how you are, to a certain extent, moving the idea of belonging from something that is attached to place to something that is attached to time by choosing the, moving the Wort, klingt wie Ort, you're moving that into phrase, sound phrase, phase. Yes.
Well, it seems to me often in this book and often in many books, translators look along the spectrum of medium and message and try to figure out what in any given instance is key. And I think very often in this book, the spectrum tilts toward medium. That the language has to sound a certain way, which I was delighted by because I'm a very acoustic translator anyway. And it seemed to me that the fact that these words rhymed in German needed to emerge in some way. And so instead of Wort and Ort, I went a different way semantically in order to capture the acoustic qualities of this phrase. And you always say to yourself, hope it works. And so I hope it works for you.
It makes it different, but it works.
I mean, there are a whole bunch of things that I could point out in this paragraph that are really very different in the German. And I don't know if you want to go into all of those, but for example, in the quite cold all over again, yours was more temporal, and all over again can also mean that you were cold from head to toe. And so it takes on a more physical sense, which in the song I thought was quite a lucky moment. We often hear the phrase, lost in translation. Every once in a while you get that inkling of a maybe also found in translation.
Actually, it's a Russian play to find something and to hide yourself, or to find something when another person always used to say it's cold now, it means you are far from this hidden object, and when you are moving closer, they say...
Right, they say that in children's games too.
It was this... Yeah, and there's another thing, for example, in German, and this word is very important, but it's also a German word which is so marked, and it's tun. Because tun, from tun derives täter, and it's like to do something and
perpetrate, and that's the problem in English, that we have two different language families working against each other, fancy words and romance words and perpetrated.
Exactly.
And then you have plain spoken words which are dramatic.
So if you are using tun in German, so the whole passage with this I don't want to do anything has the meaning if you're not doing anything, you're not perpetrator. So it's almost impossible to create the same line in English. So Shelley was looking for other ways to create new lines to.
In the translation, you really don't want to stay on the level of word for word, or sometimes even sentence for sentence, but you want in larger units, you want to go for something that has that carries along the same spirit, and sometimes different wording gets you to the place that recreates the resonance of the text to your new readership, and so I try to be as sensitive to that as possible and use phrases that might give a new readership a sense of what's going on with the words, how the words are playing with each other and interacting with each other.
Exactly.
Sometimes that seems more important.
Like tackle onto my tongue. So there are many places where these alliterations are lost and they are created in some other places. So actually, we both are very fond of alliteration, and we didn't always get it in the same place, yes. But I loved, you may have heard that I emphasized that a little bit when I read that last line, because I wanted all those dentals to come through and really, in a very staccato kind of way, tacked onto my tongue. And of course, where I grew up in Queens, we would dentalize our T's and D's. I've trained myself for many years not to speak like a New Yorker, but it comes through. Still, I'm very fascinated by dentals, and I try to sneak them in, and this one worked.
This idea of trying to really get the not concepts, you don't like concepts, but the ideas across rather than the word for word.
Or the feelings.
Or the feelings. So you wouldn't mind, how do you feel about that if your text were to be changed in order to convey the essence of it, but not the words? You wouldn't mind that,
Yeah, but fortunately, I don't know that many languages. No, but it's really a hard thing because language for this book was so important that actually I had to write this book in all languages I don't know, or I know a little bit, so because it's writing out of these restrictions. So also in German I was looking for words. But the point is that what is hidden, that actually this book is already a sort of lost in translation, because it has to be written in Russian, but the original doesn't exist. So, but all the time I recognize something I was not really conscious about. Like, in this passage there is I. Yeah. I know the rhythm. It's a verse of Владислав Ходосевич, я что за дикое слово, разве мама любила такого. So it's like all the time something there rhythmically from Russian poems.
Yes.
So, and I had a small seminar with translators of my book. It was really an extreme fun because my German in this group was the worst. They were just not difficult because there are people who studied German or bilingual or whatever, and it was really interesting experience. And I was always telling, it's a Russian poem, and here I mean this and that, and one translator that said. So of course they are really different concepts of translating, and some people trying to create an image and not to.
But it's really interesting because one thing we were talking about earlier was that it's not about the words so much, but about syntax very often. It's about syntax, it's about rhythm, and that seems to be, if it's the syntax that is in your head because of this Russian poem, then that translates into the way you write the German.
Of course, rhythmics and first thing.
Yeah.
And for English language readers, and even for American language readers, maybe even more strongly, the syntactical patterns, these very, very long sentences, hit you in a different way. German, of course, is famous for very long sentences, and comma splices seem even more important to American writers than to British writers, and not very important at all to German writers. The sheer number of comma splices here, independent clauses, independent thoughts strung together with commas rather than periods or the dreaded semicolon. I'm a real fan of semicolons, but that's a subject for another day. Yes, that's a subject for another day. We may, unless we want to stay to duel right here and now.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of trying to make this work, and of course the fact that this is in lowercase all the way through, you know, it all of a sudden turns into E. Cummings look, allows for that. It opens the door to that without that instant reaction of what's going on here, because this signals lyricism that allows you to tug at the edges of what the English language allows. And it's very nice to have that extra little wiggle room for it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's what you have the freedom, and then you have the freedom again, don't you? Yes.
Right. In the U.S., a recently deceased translator, Gregory Rabasa, who translated from Spanish, he translated Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude and many other things. And he wrote, somewhat very controversially, he said that translation is actually the purest of all writing, because things like the plot and the chapters and everything, that's already done. You can just write your heart out. We can maybe talk about that more in the horrifying way, but I'll just put that out there.
That's really great.
I would like to move on to another area, wordplay, because there's a lot of play with words, and it relates to this idea of freedom with the language, especially with a new language, which you stand outside of, so you see a lot more of it, because it isn't so loaded with meaning. You see more the sound shapes and things like that. Yeah, okay, good. No?
I'm protesting against wordplay, because it's like something artificial and created, and actually I think in translation it was also very, very important. It's not about play, it's about listening to language and what language actually is telling you, and language is conducting you, and language is actually more powerful than you. So it's not like you are playing with some sort of, so that you're not constructing, you are listening. And discovering certain things.
Yes. Yeah. It's associations that the language imposes on you.
Yeah, I think it's a principal thing, because game has a sort of, zest of something which is not necessary, or which is like coming from my will, but it's not about me.
Okay.
I'm just showing you what is there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Very modest.
So yeah, I just picked out this this little sentence here. If you could just quickly read it in German.
Actually, it's very, very questionable if it's. Because I'm not a Jewish scholar, and I grew up without all these languages, and I didn't know Yiddish, I didn't know Hebrew. So all these things I'm doing, they are out of this unwissen. So even this one, it's a very, very approximate thing. So this kind of Polania. So there is a concept. So the point is, should I read in German or?
In German, please.
Polen, Polin, Polonia, Polania, Polania. Hier wohnt Gott. Drei hebräische Wörter, die aus dem slawischen Polen ein gelobtes Land der Juden waren. Also das ist tatsächlich, it's one of the explanations why actually why Jews were so attracted by Poland, because one of not very correct writing of Polsha, Poland, is this So we have to write in English. So it doesn't. But these words, and of course God is also very, very questionable. There is this concept,
but it's a good example of what you said, is where the language leads you.
Even false etymology is quite relevant.
Yeah, exactly. And it didn't pose a problem at all for translation.
I didn't actually verify that those roots mean those things, but I think possibly Katja didn't fully either, because that wasn't really the point. It became reality because it was so often cited.
But you were led from one language to another in order to discover new things. That, that's the important thing here. Okay, there are other instances where I think it was a little bit more difficult. So there's the discussion of a Familienbaum, which is not really, it's a neologism in German, it's a new word.
I didn't know.
And Katja used Familienbaum rather than Stammbaum to denote family tree. Now Stammbaum, so Stamm is the stem, the trunk, and it's very, very much sort of, mono. I don't know. It has a mono root. It's standing there. Whereas Familienbaum is much more open. Referring to a group of people, not this rootedness. And in fact, in Katja's text, they are not rooted. The Familienbaum is standing there, and people sort of fly and get tangled in it. It's a completely different concept.
I would suggest that there's another difference. Stammbaum evokes sort of you belong and you don't. There's the whole Stammbaum idea of insiders and others. And Stammbaum is honestly a kind of creepy word. And I'm assuming that Katja used Familienbaum to sidestep that. All of the sort of baggage that goes along with Stammbaum.
It's so interesting, you just make mistakes. And afterwards they are concepts of unbelievable things. So I think it was just a mistake of Russian speaker. But the point is that actually, if you're telling me that somehow on a certain level I really understood that unfortunately I'm writing a book on my family. I didn't know that I end up with this idea. But I was thinking about all kinds of families. So it was not only the idea that family is something connected to blood. I'm from a family of teachers which are connected, all with pupils, and 7 generations, as my mother said, were holding actually orphanages. So there are families and orphans, so orphans belong to us, and my parents are typical this Soviet intelligentsia. It means that cult of friendship is just the first thing, enormous thing, so it's another family. There is this beautiful Soviet expression, the Elanger, this actually pact of Ribbentrop-Molotov was called the enlargement of family of brothers. Сейчас, секундочку. Мне кто-то должен помочь. Расширение семьи, братских. So enlargement of the family of brother republics. So that was the official Soviet name for pact of Ribbentrop-Molotov. It means that conquering of Poland, was also this kind of family. So to say, bringing bad relatives back to the family. So there were many things why I needed it. And actually, in English translation, there's also this family tree as a Christmas tree. And this is also the point where it was, I think, very difficult to translate, because in German it's Tannenbaum, and in English it's Christmas tree, and actually in Russian it was just Yolka. So it's really just the name of the tree, so there is no connotation to Christmas.
In our neighborhood, we used to call it a Hanukkah bush.
Exactly. Yeah. So this kind of appropriation of, and it was the Stalin idea to, Christmas was prohibited in the Soviet Union, and Stalin in '35 decided that before the big country, he had to install everyday life and some beautiful celebrations. So it's how Christmas was put back, but without this Christmas connotation. So actually the whole Soviet Union celebrated Christmas without knowing that it was Christmas. It was New Year Eve, so we had this Yolka, Tannenbaum, and Christmas tree on the 31st of December. So more metaphysical.
Isn't it? You're translating it as Christmas tree. So the kind of tradition is the same, but it's very different. So,
I mean, no matter how you render it, you have lingering worries about it not conveying the same, what they say call word field, and range of associations. It never will.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then it's there's a new line then.
That's right. Yeah. I think we can just do this more quickly.
Oh yes, oh my.
So this was about one of your family names being down.
Yeah. Yes.
This was one of the thorniest moments.
Yeah.
Because in German, the word Stern carries both meanings, the proper name and the common noun, and I couldn't possibly capture that in one word. So I tried to, I caught it in a roundabout sort of, I can't read all of it because that water bottle is in the way. Okay, now I
part of the story.
but maybe that's one of those linguistic blocks that in its own way. We're always sort of blocked off from full meaning, and it doesn't need to be only in our minds.
Here's another one that I love.
That's exactly the point, I mean, about lost in translations. Yeah, actually, wer gehört wird, gehört dazu. I was really strong with this German thing. It means I'm telling the story about my family, about the teachers of deaf and mute kids. And I didn't know anything about that, so I was reading books on Jewishness and concept of deaf and mute in Jewish communities in the 19th century, in the 18th century. Why they taught kids actually spoken language, not sign language, and all these concepts. And actually, it turns out that the most important is to be heard. So, Shema Israel, actually it's in all languages, that you are addressing God and asking Him to listen to you. And in this mere simple act of addressing, of speaking to God, you already accepted this. So, wer gehört wird, gehört dazu. It's just unbelievable that German language carries this meaning. So it's not me who is creating. I was really, what? So therefore I am protesting protesting against this
It's not working.
games.
Yeah.
It's not. It's like you're exploring some sort of religious concept, and it's just in the language and only German. So I'm sorry, I was really like envious. To be heard is to belong. So it's a bit not just a translation, but I have to admit that thinking in Russian, writing in German, I lost many things exactly in this perspective. For example, just one example. The first chapter in the book is about departing from a Berlin railway station. And you know, in Russian, railway station is Vokzal. Do you know where it's coming from? From Warsaw. Yes. It's the Russian word for railway station. Vokzal. But there is, of course, the second false etymologization of this word is Vox and Zal. And it's coming in Russian poetry all the time. The voices in the poem. One of the most important verses of Josef Mandelstam, Concert na Vokzale. So a concert in the Vauxhall. Actually, on the railway station. And actually, it's tautological in a way. So, and only when I finished this, when I was talking to translators, suddenly I realized that my railway station in Berlin is full of these voices, and I'm thinking about this poem of Mandelstam and this kind of couple, you know, and these people talking, and this kind of fugue which is taking place in the prologue, has something to do with Vokzal, which is railway station, which is the place for voices. That's it, you know, and it's completely lost in German. Because it's only in Russian, and it creates a sort of motif in the book which is not seen. So,
but you decided not to transcribe the Russians in order to somehow.
No. But it's also Shelley knows better even than I that there are many things in the book where I'm explaining words. For example, I'm explaining that my name Petrowskaja is coming from Piotr, and it's Stein, and it's stone. So sometimes I'm explaining exactly like like Shelley chose to explain Stern, like in one sentence to show the similar words. But sometimes it's too much. So you can. So I was moving in between this thinking in different languages and explaining. And so, but proportion is very, very important thing, and it has to be chosen in
But it's hard, isn't it? It's a loss. It must have been hard to.
It's a move. It's a move.
Yeah.
I mean, this is part and parcel of all translation. As you move from one language to the other, you know, how can you make most elements of what's important in a given word, sentence, passage, do the most work? You know, how do you get the biggest bang for your buck, as we say? Sometimes it's by expanding somewhat. In English, we sometimes call things like that first sentence a stuff gloss, that you sneak in a couple of words to tip your hat. You know, what is actually going on there? And as a result, English is thought to be, not by me, but by others, to be a short language as compared to German. But in other words, fewer words. Well, there are many ways in which that's not true. For one thing, one German word can turn into many in English. But also translations from any language into any other, including mine from German into English, need to elucidate in some way to orient a new readership to things that might be intuitively obvious to the home readership. And so we have to swell things a little bit.
I'm aware of time moving on, and I was wondering, we have another longer passage. Do you still have the stomach for that? Or, shall we do that? Yeah, let's do that now. I mean, there's lots more, but yeah, let's
We've already come down from 3 to 2, so you can bear with 2, right?
Okay. I can try to be short and big. Okay, just told I know. It's from the passage about my great grandmother who was shot in Kiev during the massacre in Babi Yar, but she didn't manage to go there. She was left in Kiev when the whole family was evacuated, and she was too old to be taken with the family. And it's a small passage inside her going towards her death. So in a way, it's a sort of lyrical, how to say, meditation. Yes, it's exactly what happened afterwards. I understood that actually it's how Homer described the show before the Achilles was killed. So it's like trying to slow down, this kind of moving. And it's a story about ficus. My father told me where we have to start.
Others of the voice track. I have it in front of me.
Okay, so that's a story my father told me about his evacuation. So he was saved, he moved from Kiev, and he told me that his father, he was evacuated in a track where at first big ficus, actually in German ficus, was standing.
Lucky for me.
What?
Lucky for me that the words are so similar.
Yes.
That was a gift.
Exactly, but in German, actually it's written with C, like in Latin, and like in English. And I really insisted to put K, as in a badly written shells in flower stores, because in Germany, so it's with car, and it's not correct in German actually. Just because Fiktion is with car, and just because I'm Russian and I never distinguish C and K, so because it's like K, and that's it. And therefore maybe I have to, okay, anyway, I'm using German. So, the point is that my father forgot this ficus. He told me that he was saved just because it was ficus, and in a certain point he forgot the story he told me. Die Stammesbrüder dieses Jungen, die in der Stadt geblieben waren, obwohl Stammesbruder ist ein neutraler Begriff. Lassen Sie uns Juden sagen. Es ist einfacher in dem Sinne, dass man es besser versteht, als ob man es besser verstehen könnte. Aber es ist leider auf eine fatale Weise wirklich verständlicher post factum, natürlich erst post factum, wenn man weiß, was danach passiert ist. Aber wirklich gerechtfertigt wird das, was passiert ist, das mich trotzdem nicht. Also die geblieben waren, wurden über die Jahre zusammengetrieben, oder wie meine Mutter zu schreiben pflegt in BJ. Also alle wüssten, was BJ bedeutet, oder als ob sie diesen Ort wirklich, und ich meine wirklich, nicht beim vollen Namen nennen könnten. Und dort wurden sie erschossen. Aber das wissen Sie bestimmt. Kiew ist von hier genauso weit entfernt wie Paris. Und jetzt weiß ich, wozu ich meinen Ficus brauche. Papa, du hast den Ficus vergessen. Welchen Ficus? Ich erinnere mich an keinen Ficus. Hofe, Dunkel, Säcke, Kisten, aber ein Ficus? Papa, aber du hast mir doch von dem Ficus erzählt, der vom Lastwagen wieder heruntergenommen wurde. Was für ein Fikus, ich erinnere mich nicht daran, vielleicht habe ich das vergessen. Ich war auf den Fikus fixiert, ich war fokussiert. Ich verstand nicht, wie man so etwas vergessen kann. Ich verstand nicht, was jemandem, das ist nicht mein Schuld, was jemandem passiert sein musste, um so etwas zu vergessen. Der Fikus scheint mir die Hauptfigur, ja, aber nicht der Weltgeschichte, denn meine Familiengeschichte zu sein. In meiner Fassung hat der Fikus das Leben meines Vaters gerettet. Doch wenn selbst mein Vater sich nicht mehr an den Fikus erinnern kann, dann hat es ihn vielleicht tatsächlich nicht gegeben. Als er mir von der Evakuierung erzählte, habe ich in meinem Bild möglicherweise die fehlenden Details in die Lücken des Straßenraums eingefügt. Gab es einen Fikus oder ist da eine Fiktion? Wurde die Fiktion aus dem Fikus geboren oder umgekehrt? Vielleicht werde ich nie feststellen, ob der Fikus, der meinen Vater gerettet hat, überhaupt irgendwann existiert. Ich rufe meinen Vater an und er tröstet mich. Sogar wenn er nicht existiert hat, sagen solche Fehlleistungen manchmal mehr aus als eine penibel gefüllte Bestandsaufnahme. Manchmal ist es gerade die Prise Dichtung, welche die Erinnerung wahrheitsgetreu macht. So wurde mein fiktiver Fikus als literarischer Gegenstand rehabilitiert. Noch keine Woche war vergangen, als mein Vater zu mir sagte, ich glaube, ich erinnere mich an einen Fikus. Vielleicht. Oder habe ich den Fikus jetzt von dir? Weil mein Großvater, ich glaube, wir wollten uns das Fiktion, nein?
Ich denke, yeah, because the English is already licensed.
Ah, okay, weil eigentlich das Ganze ändert, es hat sich also herausgestellt, ja, okay.
Ja, man muss natürlich das
Es führt zur Fiktion.
So this ficus and fiction and focus and whatever was great fun, and actually in an earlier draft of I was fixated on that ficus. I was ficusated. I was focused on that ficus. You might say I was ficused, and so there were many options for it because English lent itself perfectly to capturing that. It was actually surprisingly easy to cope with that. Do you have the German? Do you want to put the German up and English?
I'm wondering whether in the service of time we should just open up to questions. Is that all right? People have read it, so I think.
Could we still see the German on the screen?
Oh, absolutely, right, yes, we can do that. Oh no, actually, it's on there.
So a lot of times we
Well, in that case, let's read. Come on, let's do it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll speed read.
Oh, that's English, right.
Others of the boys' tribe, those who had remained in the city, although others of the tribe is so neutral, let's say Jews, it's easier in the sense that it is better understood, as though it could be understood better, but it is, unfortunately or devastatingly, truly easier to understand after the fact, of course, only after the fact, once you know what happened afterward, but that doesn't actually justify what happened anyway. So, those who had remained in the city were rounded up in Baba Yar, or as my mother always writes, B-Y, as though everyone knows what B-Y means, as though she really, and I mean really, couldn't call this place by its full name. And they were shot to death there, but you surely know that. Kiev is just as far from here as Paris. And now I know what I need my ficus for. Papa, you forgot the ficus. What ficus? I don't remember any ficus. Suitcases, bundles, crates, bags, crates, but a ficus? Papa, you did tell me about the ficus that was taken back down from the truck. Which ficus? I don't recall that. Maybe I forgot. I was fixated on that ficus. I was ficusated. I didn't understand how something like that could be forgotten. I didn't understand what must have happened to forget something like that. The ficus strikes me as the main character of the history, if not of the world, then of my family. In my version, the ficus saved my father's life. But if even my father can no longer remember the ficus, maybe it didn't really exist. Keep in mind the title of the book, Maybe Esther. There's a lot of maybe-ness going on here. Sorry to interrupt. When he told me about the evacuation, maybe I inserted the missing details into the blanks of the street. Did the ficus exist, or was it a fiction? Was the fiction born from the ficus or the other way around? I may never find out whether the ficus that saved my father ever existed at all. I call up my father, and he comforts me. Even if he didn't exist, these kinds of mistakes sometimes tell us more than a painstaking inventory. Sometimes that pinch of poetry is the very thing that makes memory truth. And so my fictive ficus was vindicated as a literary subject.
Questions? Yes.
I was struck by the fact that at the beginning, Katja, you said that, and quite rightly, obviously, that you have to say to the English publisher, this is not a memoir. And I find myself that publishers, they always want to pigeonhole the book into a certain genre. And often, some of the best books cannot be pigeonholed. And I just wondered whether you'd had any difficulty in getting an English language publisher to pick the book up. Or was it picked up quite easily?
Do you even know how it was picked up? What? Do you know how it was picked up?
There is a big publishing house, Sulkamp, and they were selling rights.
Yes, so the publisher to publisher. Yeah.
We usually have very little sense of how the transactions happen.
No, I was interested because I've been recently looking for a publisher for Leben in zwei Welten by Rosa Behrenfeld. And I've been fortunate because the academics who put together the book, the German academics, paid my time for me to look for a publisher for them. So, but I had to go through 2025 until we thought we'd found one. And it was because of this business of pigeonholing. You know, it's not a biography, it's not an autobiography, it's not a memoir. But,
well, in terms of pigeonholing, it's not just by the label that you attach to the genre, as it were, but also the cover. I'd just like to show you the original paperback German cover. I'd like to show you the hardback, that's also here, which evokes a very different sense already, because publishers have this ability. Here is the British paperback, and here is the American, both hardback and paperback. They convey very different feelings. Have you seen this at all? And so, in fact, you almost see Stamm on them. And these, in addition to whatever label you may give it for Library of Congress numbers and shelving in bookstores, the cover tells you, speaks volumes about what's in it. And we have typically little to no control over that. We also have, and this is not very well known, we translators, and I don't know if this is also true of authors, but we have very little control over the titles of our books. I translated a book recently that's coming out with a vastly different subtitle. I won't get into that, but it presupposes a different market from the one I had expected.
Yeah, with Maybe Esther, no. I mean, because I was fighting for Vielleicht Esther as crazy, you know. Really, because all 10 editors didn't want this title.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little bit more about the problem or the relationship between you and the editor. We had that question early on today, and so I would be interested in how that happened. Or was there any intervention of the editor, or how did you submit your manuscript? Did you have already somebody else who went with you over the German, or was it what is the degree that there is somebody else intervening smoothing out your German to make it palatable. I would like to
Moving
hear.
with me.
Yeah,
You're pouring salt on a wound there.
No, I'm okay. So I met like 17 years ago on the playground, incredible woman who forced me to write in German, and she was from Switzerland and worked for Untitled. She lived also many years in the States. So actually, it's a sort of a Russian Swiss book because we rewrite each text like 100 times, maybe 60. So it means that my German is not that good. It means that I'm writing without articles, and then she puts articles, and then the rhythm is completely different, and then I have to rewrite to gain the rhythm, and then she corrects words, and it's again 3 syllables and not 4, or vice versa. So I have to get this rhythm. So it was quite, or I was making some things, and she told me it's not convincing. So I had to leave some of them and to put some of them in a more convincing way, which is not. So it would have been completely different without her, of course. And she believed in me because I'm not that. So she just forced me to go on, and actually the whole idea from the beginning, it was. I just wrote a few essays in German in my life, and then I wrote a text on Soviet childhood, and it was for Sukab, for this big publishing house, and one of the most amazing editors from this publishing house who actually brought almost 800 books from East European space into Sukab, and she is also partly guilty for the fame of Hungarian literature in Germany and so on. So she just asked me what I'm actually doing, and I said that I'm thinking about this, and this, like 7 projects. And she said, just start with this one, and it was about my family. And I said, I have already started, and she told me just show me 50 pages, and we'll see. But I mean, till that time I had just maybe 10 texts in German. And, but I started to write a column in Frankfurt Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung, which was also a very funny story because there are no people who get columns after 10 texts. So it was my favorite job. It was a satirical column. And more or less. And so it's hard to explain. And there are people like that, like these editors, they just believe in you. And okay, it started completely without money. That's another side of the story. Because I experienced in this Bachmann Prize that during this Bachmann Prize that people who were standing next to me and actually promoting their books, which were already written but not published, they had incredible amount of money just to write this book, and it was not my case. But anyway, and in Sukab, he was writing first that. So that's one the story.
I want to ask a sort of similar question about the translation process. And you have a different relationship with translators whose language you do speak, like UK speech, or other languages that you don't speak, it could be translated into saying.
Yeah, of course it's very different, and I think it's not easy for a translator to translate books of authors who are still alive and know your language. So, and it's really hard. And in my case, language was really more important than the topic, if I may say that. So, but there are still many different perspectives how to translate. And if you, on the end, accept the concept or trust or whatever, it's still a lot of arbeit. But it was not easy for me, and maybe it was the first language which I more or less knew, of course, not to a certain that extent. So it wasn't easy. Of course, it wasn't easy, but I like it very much now. I mean, I think I was panicking. I was incredibly panicking. There was a certain point when I was so depressed and sort of, like you're losing sort of authentical state, and so it was much easier to work with Dutch and Hungarian because you cannot control, so you can talk about certain things, agree about certain things, and that's it. And in English you think, no, it's not this word because I don't know this word, so I cannot use this word. So it was really a little bit too much, I think, control in this.
You were born in Ukraine, and Ukraine.
I was born in Soviet Union.
Yes, you were born in Soviet Union. You were born in Kiev, where I don't know, but in contemporary Ukraine there are 2 languages spoken. So I don't know whether you have any experience of Ukrainian, and whether what is your sort of relationship to what has happened since in Ukraine. Also, have you been translated into Russian? And just another last question. What your answer to the question before last? If this woman, your editor, as you described her, it seems as if she has a big stake in this book, in the text of the book. I wonder whether a co-authorship was ever maybe discussed or co-authorship.
No. So she was not, I was talking about the writing process with many friends, and she was actually correcting grammar, and she was suggesting some stylistic things as a normal editor, but there was another editor who actually was above all of us from Suka, and she also suggested a few things, but I was fighting with her. It was really not funny. So there were other things I was thinking afterwards, after the success, how to pay her, because she was doing everything for me without money all this time, because I didn't have money at all. So actually this book is a result of unemployment. That's it. So Ukrainian and Russian. I grew up in the Russian city. Now it's like it's very mixed, because there is a new generation in Kiev speaking Ukrainian. People who didn't move from Kiev are truly bilingual, of my age. All my friends are bilingual, but I moved when I was 16, so I'm like, there was a joke about nationalists and internationalists in Soviet Union. So nationalists in Soviet Union speak 2 languages, and internationalists speak 1. I'm more like the second one, and it's really funny because I moved to Moscow and then I moved to Estonia, and when I was back, all my friends spoke 2 languages freely, and so I'm like a relic of Soviet era, and sometimes it's not funny. But when I'm writing in Russian, actually this Ukrainian substrate is very important, incredibly important, because there is no reduction of vowels in Ukrainian. It's more like single language. Of course, everybody would tell me it's a colonial approach, because it's funnier, it's more lyric, it's all these things, like usual things. Yeah, maybe it's a colonial approach, but it's still true. Because it's really more symbolic, and it has a certain touch. And so when I'm writing in Russian, there are some local things, and it's a very interesting topic, this kind of Russian-Ukrainian, it's not Russian-Ukrainian, but this kind of writing in Russian, knowing obviously like languages from childhood. It's very different, and I mean, one don't need to know Gogol or things like that, but it's really obvious.
I think we have probably exhausted you, but I would like to thank you again. It was absolutely wonderful.
Delighted to be chairing this, or introducing Rebecca Walkowitz, their keynote speaker this morning. Rebecca is professor and chair in the English department and affiliate faculty in the Comparative Literature program at Rutgers University. She studied American history and literature in Harvard, Radcliffe, was awarded an MPhil in English literature and critical theory from the University of Sussex, and an MA and PhD in English and American literature from Harvard. She is co-editor and co-founder of the book series Literature Now, and has served in the executive committees of the American Comparative Literature Association, the Society for Novel Studies, and the Modernist Studies Association, for which she served as president in 2014-15. She is the author or editor of 10 books, including Cosmopolitan Style, Modernism Beyond the Nation, and Born Translated, the contemporary novel in an age of world literature, which received honourable mention for the first annual Matei Kalnescu Prize from the MLA. Her current book project, Future Reading, focuses on the concept of the Anglophone and the representation of world languages in contemporary writing. Rebecca has delivered distinguished lectures all over the globe, in Asia, Europe, Australia, and throughout North America, including the Wolfgang Iser Lecture at the University of Constance in 2017, and earlier this year, the George Steiner Lecture at Queen Mary University of London. So we're delighted that you've come back to London again this morning and today, or yesterday, and that you're here to deliver your keynote address on Yoko Towada and the New Migrant novel. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm so glad that I could come back and be here for these conversations. It's been terrific being a part of them yesterday afternoon and this morning. I am going to talk about Lahiri and Towada, and it's been great to hear so many other papers on these novelists, so I know that we'll have a good conversation. I want to particularly thank Deirdre Burns and Maria Cristina Secchia and Godela Vice Sussex for their invitation, for their generous welcome, and for organizing all of us, and also thank John Millington and Joe Bradley from the School of Advanced Study for their work bringing us together. I'm mindful and deeply appreciative of the intellectual hospitality expressed by occasions of this kind. I'm also mindful and deeply appreciative that our conversation today is made possible by a fundamental commitment to international exchange, which is both a condition and a theme of our conference. We've been asked to think about the translingual imagination of literature, but I want to acknowledge the translingual imagination that has helped to shape this program of talks. It's not often that I have the honor to stand alongside scholars whose institutional and biographical origins span so many geographies. We hail from near and far, and I'm grateful that we're able to gather here together. Sometimes we forget that what seems to be bounded within one nation is in fact made possible by histories of cooperation and mobility among many nations. National histories are comparative histories. As we say in the language of my hometown, New York City, somos todos migrantes. 100 years ago, the people of Denmark hosted my great-grandparents and their young family as they fled Poland and waded through the First World War to join their extended family in the United States. My grandfather was born in Denmark. When he was 5, he and his parents were able to arrange passage on the Helig Olaf, a Scandinavian-operated ship built in Glasgow by Alexander Stephen and Sons. That Danish-Scottish ship brought 5-year-old Saul and his family to Copenhagen, from Copenhagen to Ellis Island, where they were admitted and the family settled. I and many other Americans have been nourished by the economic and political cooperation of European nations and nations well beyond Europe. My postgraduate career was launched by 2 years of study as a Marshall Scholar at the Critical Theory program at the University of Sussex in the early 1990s. In 1953, Parliament established the Marshall Scholarship as a living gift to the United States in recognition of the economic aid provided to the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and other nations in the wake of the Second World War. 72 years ago, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall announced the plan for U.S. aid at Harvard's commencement exercises, which were celebrated yesterday in Boston. Marshall's insistence on large-scale coordinated relief for Europe was recognized on both sides of the Atlantic as a historic opportunity for multilateral cooperation. On the 70th anniversary, scholars and government ministers gathered at Harvard to consider the legacy of that multilateral experiment in the context of rising isolationism, including the isolationism advocated by the present US and UK governments. These conversations about political and personal history are crucial to our conversations about literary history, since recognizing the collaborative origins of our present moment is necessary to the prospect and vision of any collaboration to come. We normally expect migrant writers to occupy, renovate, or transform dominant tongues. James Joyce established a model that later colonial and post-colonial writers would follow. You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. Like Caliban, Joyce could curse his rulers eloquently. Even better, he could outdo them. Stephen Dedalus famously announces that he speaks better English than the English, and he does. With Ulysses, Joyce not only reset the standard for English language fiction, he changed the English language for good. More than half a century later, Salman Rushdie would win the Booker of Bookers, the award for most important Booker Prize novel, for Midnight's Children, and yet another non-British British writer would introduce new words and new formulations into English language writing, mixing up English and changing what the British novel could and should sound like. Rushdie's project, like Joyce's, was to enter, remake, and surpass Anglophone literary history. He wanted to change what would count and what would be celebrated as English language prose. This paper begins from the observation that migrant writers no longer agree that mastering the dominant language is the best way of contesting the monolingualism and racism of national literatures. Instead, writers such as Jhumpa Lahiri and Yoko Towada have been choosing not to know. Not knowing, they suggest, opens up alternatives to the choice between obligation, having to use a language, and injunction, being blocked from using it. Not knowing, by which they often mean not knowing well or not knowing fluently, brings greater visibility to the long history of conflict and collaboration within languages, shifting the conversation from the possession of languages to the politics of competency, language sharing, and relative fluency. Lahiri and Towada are first-generation migrants producing fiction in second or third languages. Their works operate in the Anglophone context, but in different ways, and those works are not exclusively or even principally Anglophone. Today, Jhumpa Lahiri is publishing English translations of Italian writing. Sometimes she's publishing translations of her own work, and sometimes she is publishing translations of another writer's work. Yoko Towada is writing novels in German and Japanese while winning major national book prizes with her translators for her fiction in English. Her characters are often writing or speaking in second or third languages, or in languages they don't entirely understand. Sometimes there is no source language, or the source seems to be a target language from the start. In each of these cases, the linear structure of inheritance and influence is disrupted by the recursive and tangential appearance of adaptations, simultaneous translations, and competing originals. All of these works lay claim to the dispossession of languages that involves unlearning English and also learning but not mastering other tongues. Anglophone fiction becomes more worldly, these writers suggest, by becoming more provincial. This involves nourishing and expanding English's debts to other languages, renouncing originality, and revising rather than finalizing first editions. In the 21st century, it's time not to know on purpose. So part one, writing in a foreign language. First, a little recent book history, some of which will recap and slightly shift the conversation about Lahiri, I think. Jhumpa Lahiri has published at least 4 Anglophone books in the past 3 years. In February 2016, she released In Other Words, a memoir about the experience of learning the Italian language, which appeared in a facing page translation with Lahiri's original Italian on the verso side and Anne Goldstein's English translation on the recto. In November 2016, she published The Clothing of Books, a cluster of essays about book covers based on lectures delivered in Italian, later published as a bilingual chapbook in Italy with a translation to English by Lahiri's husband, and subsequently revised and slightly retranslated by Lahiri for a monolingual English edition published in the United States. The version published in New York by Vintage Books in 2016, presented as a Vintage Books original, is both a first and second translation. A second translation because it is based on the English text published in Florence by the Santa Maddalena Foundation in 2015. A first translation because revising the Florence version, Lahiri updated the original Italian. That makes 2 or possibly 3 Anglophone books. In March 2017, Lahiri published an English translation of Domenico Starnone's award-winning Italian novel, known in English as Ties, and in March 2018, she translated and published Starnone's Trick. That's one more. This output is striking not so much because it is prolific, though it is, but because until 3 years ago, Lahiri was best known as the author of 4 works of English language fiction, including her debut, The Interpreter of Maladies, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize in 2000. Now, as she puts it, she is an Anglophone writer who produces books in Italian. She's changed genre from fiction to memoir and essay, changed original languages from English to Italian, and changed her relationship to English, which she is using as a target language, but not as a source. Lahiri has not simply reorganized or swapped languages. She has altered the way she uses language. She is now writing in a tongue she knows, as she says, imperfectly. Her memoir is therefore not only about the experience of learning a language, it is also about the decision to give up the language she knows perfectly for a language she does not know or does not know well. Lahiri says in the English version of her memoir, I remain in Italian an ignorant writer. An ignorant writer. The use of the word ignorant is jarring. Let's see if we can get this slide to come on. Second. The use of the word ignorant is jarring, rude, disparaging. And I just want to see if I can get you this page here. Yay, okay. The use of the word ignorant is jarring, rude, disparaging. As we look across the pages, we can consider Anne Goldstein's decision to render Lahiri's Italian word inconsapevole in this way. She chooses ignorant over unaware, imperfect, unknowing, unconscious, and imprecise. How different to be an imprecise writer, or one who is unaware of the nuances or tonal implications of the language he is using. In the original, that is the Italian, I think Lahiri believes she's making a straightforward statement about proficiency. You either have it or you don't. I remain an Italian, an unaware writer. I remain an Italian, an imperfect writer. Choosing ignorant, Goldstein brings out something important about the anecdotes that surround this claim. In Lahiri's narrative, not knowing is a condition of belonging, as well as a condition of mind. So there are really 2 ideas of not knowing presented in the memoir. The first refers to the idea of not knowing that anyone who has ever tried to learn a new language, or a language from another historical period, can experience. It is the idea of not knowing that Virginia Woolf talks about in her essay on Not Knowing Greek, in which the lack of immersion in a culture impedes our ability to write or read unconsciously, or confidently, as those who live in that culture may do. This is the idea of not knowing that leads Lahiri to say that she can write in Italian, but can't become an Italian writer. The second idea of not knowing, which Woolf describes in 3 Guineas and elsewhere, refers to the history of institutions, family custom, and political geography that make the acquisition of languages possible for some, impossible for others, and that makes only some uses of language seem knowledgeable while others seem labored or unlearned. In this idea of not knowing, there is no ontology of ignorance. It is a social phenomenon. We see this in Lahiri's chapter titled The Wall, in which she relates the way her physical appearance affects people's judgments about her linguistic fluency and place of origin. When she speaks Italian, shop clerks claim they can't understand her. They act, she says, as if my Italian were another language. They don't understand me because they don't want to understand me. They don't understand me because they don't want to listen to me, accept me. That's how the wall works. The wall is primarily activated by the difference between what Italians think Europeans look like and what Lahiri looks like, but it is also triggered by assumptions about how and why women acquire new languages. Lahiri reports being asked by an Italian colleague to whom she was speaking in Italian, if I learned Italian from my husband. Later in the chapter, in a rare moment of political commentary, Lahiri scales up her analysis. She writes, I think of people who were born and grew up in Italy, who consider Italy their homeland, who speak Italian perfectly, but who, in the eyes of certain Italians, seem foreign. Seeming foreign, she intimates in a brief anecdote about her American experience, can prompt rhetorical violence, whose most extreme insult is the presumption of linguistic ignorance. She recalls a man on the street from whom she refuses a flyer, yelling after her, "What the fuck is your problem? Can't speak English?" These anecdotes about xenophobia and racism, at first located in Italy but later placed in the United States, help to explain why Goldstein chose the more charged derogatory term to convey Lahiri's sense of imprecision. If there are two ideas of not knowing in Lahiri's memoir, there are also two ideas of language. The first imagines that there is a national language to know, and that there can be a perfect understanding of that language, which some people possess. The second treats language as a custom of the tribe, for which the appearance of perfection depends on social, political, and corporeal assumptions about who possesses language and how. In theories of world literature, as in Lahiri's memoir and essays, the first idea of language, monolingual, coherent, synchronic, dominates. We use this idea every time we talk about literary works moving out from one language to other languages, or about global Anglophone fiction as a compilation of English language works, or about multilingual works that deploy several national tongues. This is language as a possession. Yet in the conclusions and afterword of her memoir, in her essays about book covers, and in the chapter on the wall, Lahiri invites us to consider how practices of collaboration and exclusion reveal a more dynamic, more historical idea of language. In Lahiri's latest works, a focus on the embodiment of books, the visual culture of words, and the mechanisms of circulation and literacy is changing the shape and meaning of Anglophone literature. Writing in a foreign tongue, it turns out, generates new ideas of writing in English. The British novelist, essayist, and translator Tim Parks, about whom we heard something yesterday, who has lived in Italy for many years, has criticized Lahiri for failing to write about Italy or Italians in her memoir. With all this effort to clarify, magnify, dramatize, and romanticize the decision to write in Italian, he avers, there is simply no room for Italy or the Italians. He concludes, I can think of no other book set in Italy that has less of the color and drama of Italy in it. Parks is certainly right to observe that Italy is not Lahiri's topic. If there is realism in the memoir, it is not the realism of neighborhoods, local types, or idiomatic speech. There is a social milieu in Lahiri's book, but it is the social milieu of language acquisition, writing, editing, translating, publishing, and printing. Lahiri's memoir contributes to what I am calling a realism of languages. Analyzing the history and condition of language use, Lahiri tells us that she chose Italian because she sought an alternative to the languages of her environment. She had, she says, no real need to know Italian, but was prompted instead by intellectual and emotional desire. She was looking to escape the filial, economic, cultural, and national obligations that structure her relationship to English, the language she writes fluently, and Bengali, the mother tongue she can neither read nor write. As the child of immigrants, she feels foreign in both languages, though she uses English confidently. Learning Italian is not so much a decision to give up knowing for not knowing. It is a decision to choose not knowing rather than have not knowing thrust upon her. The project of affirmative not knowing distinguishes Lahiri from the translingual modernist whom she invokes over the course of her memoir, writers such as Samuel Beckett, Vladimir Nabokov, Joseph Conrad, and Fernando Pessoa. She thinks the difference has to do with immersion. She has not lived in a new country for decades the way that Beckett learned French, and she did not acquire her new language as a child the way that Nabokov learned English. Instead, she is writing in a language she has adopted as an adult through private lessons and self-study. She has lived in Italy for only 1 year. This means that she can write in Italian only with the tools or scaffolding, these are the words she uses, referring to the dictionaries, language teachers, editors, and friends whom she consults in the making of the book. Yet, Lahiri's fundamental difference from the modernists is not really her level of fluency or quality of immersion. It is her decision to show us the collective process of learning and using languages. In other words, maybe a memoir, a genre we associate with the history of the self, but it is a memoir about the self's reliance on other selves. The memoir's form and format, the words on the page, are irreducible to one. There is no unique voice, because it has been translated and edited by other voices, and because Lahiri is unable to deploy the full lexicon and precise expressivity of a fluent speaker. From the beginning to the concluding chapters and afterward, Lahiri enters into language in the company and through the offices of others. In this crucial way, all the words in Lahiri's memoir are other words, words produced with others, as well as produced in a language other than her own. Of course, distinguishing between the language she writes with tools and the language she writes on her own, Lahiri seems to think of herself as someone who has left one tongue, English, for another, Italian. The facing page translation reinforces this separation visually. In the narrative, however, languages are less homogeneous, less monolingual, and less separate than the book's format implies. For reasons of time, let me simply list a few of the ways. First, there is the fact that Lahiri treats language, especially fluency, as a social rather than an empirical fact. There is no objective case in which we can say a single language in its perfect state is being written. This is dramatized by Lahiri's decision to place Goldstein's text on the recto page. She could have provided her own English translation or rewriting of the text, but instead she presents the translator's approximation of her approximation. Second, Lahiri insists that she will use language in a non-fluent way, and this non-fluency is enabling, not simply a failure. In the past, women writers and migrants have been excluded from civic literacy because they lack access to language education. Lahiri locates not knowing within that history, but she also refunctions not knowing as an affirmative strategy of anti-racist cosmopolitanism. She is choosing to become an ignorant writer. Linking her experience as a visitor to Italy to the experience of unaccepted Italians, Lahiri suggests that she and they speak and write a version of Italian, and that Italian has versions. Third, Lahiri tells us that she acquired an interest in Italian by studying 16th century English playwrights who were influenced by Italian architecture. Lahiri's recognition that Italy was symbolically and intellectually significant to early modern English literature points towards the multilingual sources of her text, to be sure, but also towards the changing meaning of Italian as a language of the European South. For the English, Italy has been a source of exoticism as well as a source of learning. It is a minor language within contemporary Europe and a dominant language within world literature. In Lahiri's book, it is hard to say whether Italian is the language of the mind or the language of the heart, and in this sense it is hard to establish a unique symbolic value for Lahiri's choice to use it. Fourth, Lahiri presents us with progress rather than completion. We are reading an unfinished work because it begins in a language Lahiri is still learning, and because she and her translators have rewritten the work and will continue to rewrite it. In the US edition of the memoir, please come sit. In the US edition of the memoir, readers of Goldstein's English translation are constantly aware of Lahiri's original Italian on the facing page, and thus approximation is in effect a format in the history of the book. But within the narrative too, we are asked to think about the author's imprecision, her ignorant writing, and the editing, correcting, revising, and reprinting that influenced the original manuscript. The afterword of The Clothing of Books, published a few months after the memoir, goes even further. Referring to the first English edition, she writes, "Back in Rome, After slightly modifying the translation, after correcting a couple of mistakes and adding one or two new thoughts, I had to reword the Italian text, translating myself, this time from English, in order to arrive at the final version. I'm struck by this repeated crossing between the two languages in which I write. I realize how useful it is to move back and forth linguistically. I also realize that the process is endless, and that, as a result, the final version continues to elude me. The final version at the end of this passage is different from the final version at the start. Using the translation in her second language to modify the original in her third language, Lahiri acknowledges that the versions of her work are no longer separate or even serial. Translation has extended or even trumped production. Appearing as English translations of Italian books produced by an Anglophone writer, In Other Words and The Clothing of Books decouple the relationship between writer and language and between writer and book that have informed our theories of world literature to date. In those theories, world literature is a single-authored object autonomously produced within a dominant language before traveling out to other languages. Lahiri's books don't belong to Italian literary culture in any straightforward way, nor does she want them to. She describes her memoir as an indigenous book born and raised here in Italy, but she does not claim to be an indigenous author, and she has embraced Italian as a language in which she will never be a native speaker. English is the language she knows. Italian is the language she is using. In the gap between knowledge and use, Lahiri is generating a body of intralingual prose that challenges monolingual literary histories based on language fluency and the civic belonging that the premise of language fluency has conferred. In Other Words and The Clothing of Books are English translations of works in non-fluent Italian by an Anglophone writer. They are dual language editions that present the author's national language on the target side. They are works produced in collaboration among writers, editors, publishers, translators, friends, spouses, newspapers, and publishing houses located variously in Italy and the United States. They are texts whose translations have altered their originals and in some ways become originals. They are narratives that emphasize the dynamic experience of language acquisition and language use, reminding us that the conditions of knowing and not knowing are social rather than intrinsic. Lahiri shows us that world literature involves not only the embodiment of books, but also the corporeal experience, intellectual desires, and collaborative enterprise of writers. Writing in a foreign language, Lahiri challenges us to reimagine the history and future of writing. At the end of January 2018, in the New Yorker magazine, Lahiri published a story called The Boundary, for which she is listed in front as author and in back as translator. This story represents a major shift in Lahiri's way of writing about language acquisition and in her way of approaching what it means to occupy a language as a writer or an author. The story also represents a major shift in the history of Anglophone publishing. As you can see, she has translated her own Italian into English, and as far as I know, this is the first time she has occupied both roles. It is unusual for any writer to appear as author and translator simultaneously. Lahiri had to persuade the New Yorker to credit her twice, once at the start and once at the end of the story. The New Yorker is famous for the rigidity and entrenchment of its house style, and yet this is the second time in recent memory that the magazine has altered the appearance of Anglophone fiction to meet the needs of a new kind of multilingual Anglophone writing. The first time was in 1999, when Junot Diaz insisted that only some Spanish words in his stories should appear in italics, so that other Spanish words printed in Roman font could appear to be English and Spanish at the same time. Roman font designates the local language, and Diaz wanted to choose for himself, wanted to insist that the choice is part of authorship when Spanish is foreign in his English language fiction. Manipulating orthography, Diaz is producing Anglophone fiction in Spanish. Manipulating the idea of translation, Lahiri is producing Anglophone fiction in Italian. Thematically, The Boundary is about the translation of translation. The story is narrated by a girl whose parents serve as caretakers for a rented cottage at the seaside, possibly the Italian seaside, though the geography and nationality of the characters are never specified. The girl's parents, whom she describes as foreigners, serve a visiting family who have come from the city where the caretakers first lived when they entered the country. The visitors are two children, a mother and a father. The mother is a writer, quite possibly the writer of the text we are reading. As the story continues, we learn that both families are foreign, though not in the same way. The caretakers are called foreigners because they are migrants to the nation where the events take place. The visitors are foreigners to the seaside, though they may come from another nation too. As an object and a text, the boundary seems to feature at least two boundaries: the boundary between native and foreign, and the boundary between original and translation, but the definitions aren't clear. Who are the visitors and who are the hosts? Can this story be read in the original? Is there original story to read? The effect of double approximation we saw in Anne Goldstein's rewriting of Lahiri's Italian language memoir is achieved in this case by the unfolding of first and third person narration. We encounter the first person because the caretaker's daughter is telling the story, but we encounter the third person because the story seems to have been imagined by the visiting mother, or by a writer very much like her. Mediating point of view as well as language, the boundary presents what the writer thinks, the girl thinks, the writer thinks about the girl and her family. This circulation of impressions is consolidated in the final paragraph. We learn in Lahiri's English translation that the visitors, now departed, have left behind several objects. They've forgotten, or left on purpose, a few things they don't need, things I hold on to. Pictures the girls drew, shells they picked up at the beach, the last drops of a perfumed shower gel. Shopping lists in the faint, small script that the mother used on other sheets of paper to write all about us. The girl has been watching the writer watching, and the writer has been writing about being watched. The tone of the final clause suggests that the writer may not know as much as she thinks she does. The all and all about us seems ironic, over emphatic. It conveys both too much watching and not enough seeing. The writer may not know, for example, that the caretakers experienced violent xenophobia in the city before becoming host to carefree visitors. People assume that the father, who cultivates the garden, cannot speak because he's a foreigner. In some ways, this is true. He cannot speak because he lost his teeth in an attack by an anti-immigrant gang who targeted him because of his origins. The attack took place in the city where the visiting family now lives. Displacing and also amending the tourism memoir, the story grants the narrating character more knowledge than the implied author. The anecdote at the end communicates the failure to know and also affirms it. We don't see the other sheets, but the author doesn't even realize there are other sheets to see. The author will always miss the proverbial shopping lists and near-empty bottles that tourists like herself leave behind. This is the everyday garbage that is part of the foreigner's experience. In this story, the elite cosmopolitan represented by the actual author has to give up knowledge in order to recognize how little the implied author knows about non-elite foreigners. Making translation the norm, Lahiri suggests that knowledgeable not knowing, refusing to master words, is a precondition of civic hospitality. Part 2, writing in translation. Like Lahiri's story, which appears as an original and a translation all at once, Yoko Towada's books disrupt the secrets of production and circulation, and this disruption is internal rather than ancillary to Towada's project. She often writes her book twice, once in Japanese and once in German. The second book is a book that can be read as an original, because composed by the author, and as a translation, because it appeared first in another language. This is the case with Memoirs of a Polar Bear, which appeared in Japanese in 2011 and in German in 2014. When we read memoirs in the English edition, translated from the German by Susan Bernofsky in 2016, we are reading a translation of a translation as well as a translation of an original. But we can also think about this in another way. There is really no original, no unique language of production to read. Martin Puchner has observed that the English translation of memoirs does not mention the Japanese edition on the copyright page, making the German version legally as well as linguistically original. I'll just show this to you here. It'll let me. All right. So we're seeing here the 2014 copyright on the German edition, the English edition, sorry, and originally published in the German edition. And then here on these pages you see the 2011 copyright on the Japanese edition, and then on the back of the German edition we see the 2014 copyrights. As with Lahiri, there is no embrace of a heritage language and no single literary idiom to which the work is attached or exclusively affiliated. Perhaps there is no single literary figure either. Among Germanists, she is Yoko Towada, a migrant intellectual living in Berlin and publishing in German. Among Japanese specialists, she is Towada Yoko, an experimental writer composing in Japanese while living abroad. She has won major national awards in both spaces and also in the United States, where she and her translator, Margaret Mitsukami, won the National Book Award for the English language version of The Emissary, her most recent work of fiction. Towada has changed reading and translation by making it the rule rather than the exception, and by suggesting that some works of literature belong to more than one literary history. But of course, the idea of belonging has changed too. Whereas languages have in the past seemed to be intrinsic to the literary work, here the work seems to be natural to several languages, and to imply that the author can be natural or comfortable in several languages too. With memoirs and several of her other works, the history of publication and translation complicates the distinction between domestic and foreign editions, native and foreign languages. The multilingual conditions of the original mean that there is no reading without reading in translation. Memoirs incorporates translation by dramatizing the comparative origins of the genre, in this case the fictionalized memoir narrated by a non-human animal. Towada's novel presents the memoir comparatively in three ways. By invoking prior examples, such as Kafka's story, A Report to an Academy, narrated by an ape. By showing how the memoir, normally a story of one, is here at least a story of three. And by suggesting that storytelling and writing are collaborative rather than solitary enterprises. The memoirs of the title belongs to three generations of polar bears. In the first memoir, a polar bear is writing and speaking in Russian, but it is not the language of her birthplace, which is somewhere near the North Pole. Told to write in her own language, she objects, explaining, "I don't know what that language is." The bear's first language is already a second language, even though it is the language that she knows and speaks fluently. Because she is a migrant to Russia, the bear is always writing in a foreign tongue. Any translation of the bear's text would have to involve a foreign language adapted into yet another foreign language, which under the circumstances of multiple migration seems to be the primary condition of the polar bear's existence. More than this, we're told that the memoir-writing polar bear has been encouraged to model her autobiography on a Russian translation of a masterpiece of Japanese diary literature, Sarashina Nikki. The English language translation of Towada's German language adaptation of her Japanese language novel asks us to imagine that we are reading a Russian language version of a Japanese language text. In the German edition, as Venkat Mani has noted, the text seems to coincide with the book. Language is embodied in the most literal way. The book seems to be the animal's body, as it once was when pages were skins, and the animal's body seems to be a book, whose language is activated by our touch and our interpretation. Reading Towada's novel in translation thus involves thinking about the history of writing, and it involves noticing the several origins of the story, the bear's text, as well as the narrative, Towada's text. Towada's novel raises questions about the norms of cultural ownership, the way we assign literary works to one language and obligate writers to compose in that language. Reading in translation may involve reading a literary work in a language that is native or primary to the writer, but foreign to the original version of the text. The two other memoirs in Towada's novel are focused on the first bear's daughter and grandson, respectively. They seem at various points to be narrated by a human companion or by a bear speaking about himself in the third person. Both of these structures of narration are analogs for translation and fit with the emphasis on collaboration and dispossession we saw in Lahiri's text. Attenuated narration is also a conduit for translation. It can circulate among languages, and it invites a new awareness about the collaborative nature of what appears to be an individual expression. At one point in the third memoir, we learn that the grandson, Knut, has been speaking in the third person. "You call yourself Knut?" one of the other bears asked derisively. "A bear speaking in the third person? I haven't heard anything that hilarious in a long time. Are you still a baby?" At this point, we realize for the first time in the narrative that Knut's consciousness is being described by Knut. And Knut realizes for the first time in the story that this is an unusual phenomenon. He is thinking about himself collaboratively rather than individually. Listening carefully to the conversations between Matthias and Christian, it was immediately clear that Matthias never referred to himself as Matthias. He didn't use his own name, as if his name had nothing to do with him, and left its use up to other humans. What a strange phenomenon. And what did Matthias call himself? I. What was even stranger was that Christian too referred to himself as I. Why didn't they get confused if they all kept using the same name? Towada uses the genre of the memoir, associated with the authenticity of a unique individual, to raise questions about the isolation of languages, literary histories, and human consciousness. In her novel, single voices and single languages are always modified by other voices and other words, or by signs and bodies that are not reducible to words. The paw on the page appears in the second memoir when we learn that the human trainer's narration of the bear's story is in fact the bear's narration of the human trainer's narration of the bear's story. The bear's consciousness has merged with the trainer's. The I on the top of the page, which appears to be Barbara's speech, becomes the I of the bottom half, which appears to be Tosca's. The paw print, which is unpronounceable and non-linguistic, implies that the body of the bear has entered, in some literal way, the body of the book. Towada's works are born translated, but they also emphasize the materiality of habitation and contact and the limits of linguistic possession at any scale. They can travel into many languages, and they do, but they also operate at a distance from comprehension and fluency in any tongue. Because the polar bears are migrants by profession, a famous writer, a circus performer, and a zoo animal, and were separated from their biological parents at an early age, their nationality is a function of adoption and friendship rather than inheritance. Reading Towada's novel in translation, we have to consider not only the multiple origins of all novels, but also that normalizing multiple origins may create a more ethical, more inclusive basis for collectivity. We also have to rethink the migrant novel as a genre. Here it is organized around permeable collectives rather than walled-off beginnings and destinations. Lahiri's and Towada's recent works are committed to the representation of other words, but they're creating a world literature premised on adaptation and approximation rather than accumulation and mastery. They're not adding languages so much as insisting on the multilingualism that operates within, across, underneath languages that appear to be coherent and distinct. The future of writing, they suggest, will involve giving up what we know about the conditions of literary productivity. It will involve unmaking literary boundaries. It will involve using new languages and the visual resources of media beyond languages. And it will involve the awkward, incomplete possession of languages. Sharing, subtracting, and diffusing linguistic belonging, writers in dominant languages create new pathways for literary cosmopolitanism. Thank you.